I would say that it was definitely the George Floyd protest. Those were things that were very fluid. People had very strong feelings about it. I myself had very strong feelings of it. So, on a professional level, there was significant challenges. On a personal level, seeing it as a black man, knowing that our history is very complex, and sometimes people are not always attuned with our history. But at the root of it, emergencies are about humanity, and we have to always make sure that we're tending to that.
Hi, welcome back to my channel, Mental Health with Melissa. Today I have a really special video for you. I'm going to be interviewing the City of Santa Monica Emergency Manager Coordinator. He is going to tell you information about how he handles the job in the event of disasters and emergencies and how this directly relates to the mental health of our community members. In addition to that, he's going to talk a little bit about his background and his job, and if you're interested in a more policy macro level job like his, he's going to give you more information. So don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and let's get to it. Welcome back to my channel, Mental Health with Melissa. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Stephen Torrence. Mr. Torrence works for the City of Santa Monica, and he's an emergency coordinator there.
So, my day to day, we are in charge of the emergency preparedness and emergency response for a large portion of the city. We conduct preparedness trainings internally and externally, so we work with the public on a very significant level, trying to get them prepared for any type of emergency. But at the same time, we're making sure that we are ready for the city to respond if there is a moment where there is something that is impacting a city infrastructure that requires multiple departments to work in coordination with each other. We have resources that we can deploy at a quick notice, and then also going out and making sure that if there's something that disproportionately impacts the public, we address those in order to get them back to their new normal. At that moment, we go out and we provide different types of resources, whether it be food and water or shelter, or if it's just basic services like a family assistance center for people to just kind of sit down and understand what happened and try to find closure with if they have a loss within their family or find their children. So there's different aspects of what we do in order to ensure the city returns back to normal. But on the day-to-day, we do a lot of planning and a lot of training as well to make sure the city is ready when those things happen.
Yeah, I mean, I know that you had mentioned that there's a lot of training and coordination involved, and thanks for giving information also about like the Family Resource Center. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what that entails and when people actually utilize those emergency services?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate when we have to stand that up for us, because we know that most likely when we are standing up a family assistance center and we're providing those resources, it's more than likely that someone has lost a significant part of their lives, or there's been a significant amount of change in their life. For the most part, we understand that if there's a major earthquake, people are kind of standing around looking, going, what just happened? And they're trying to figure out how they can cope with those things. What we as a city do, we do our best to stand up a family assistance center or a family resource center as quick as possible to ensure that people know that they can go and just kind of sit down for a moment. And there's professionals that are there that provide those resources that can at least help talk to them about what's happening, how they can find resources to be able to, if they need a place to sleep, we can show them a place to sleep. If they have lost a family member, there's mental health resources that are provided to them to be able to kind of talk through them. There's different people from different walks of life, and emergencies definitely change things for a lot of people, whether it be the city employees that are there or the members of the community. And those resources are all in one location, so we can ensure that people feel like the government and the local jurisdictions are there to help them as much as possible, even though those entities are actually dealing with the same thing as well.
In terms of the people that are available in these resource centers, are they employed by the city, or are they kind of like contractors to emergency services?
So most of the time they're a mix between mental health professionals that work for either the county or nonprofit organizations that the city has already created memorandums of understanding with. So we have a robust network of, we refer to them as VOADs, volunteer organizations active in disaster. And pretty much what we go out and do is we coordinate with those groups well before an emergency happens. And we know exactly what those groups can do, who to call for what type of emergency. And we do our best to say, in the event of an earthquake, would your entity be able to help respond to a mental health emergency that is happening in our city? And most of the time, they'll let us know how many people that they can provide. And we train with them as well. We understand that the county has a robust network, but at the same time, there's also moments where the county may be stressed as well. So we do our best to have redundancies put into place. And our volunteer organizations are the best thing that we can work with, because those are real people that live in our community as well. So they have a better idea of who lives here, who works here, demographics of our area, and then what are the things that people are challenged with. So we do our best to work with those volunteer organizations in collaboration with the county and professional settings.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that if the professionals that you're referring to are in the community, are familiar with the community, and are partners of the community, then the resources are going to be more accessible and available because of just the knowledge of being in the actual city and having familiarity with a lot of the organizations. Yeah, another question that I had is, what would you define as a emergency or a city emergency?
So I would define it as kind of looking at a basic home fire. My role would not get involved with a basic home fire because the fire department is able to handle it with their normal resources. And I think that's where we defined an emergency from our perspective versus an emergency from the general community. So the fire department, that is their normal duty to go out and put out fires, whether it be a car or a home. Now, when that emergency gets to the scale where they have to call in additional resources outside of the city, very similar to a wildfire, where you see firefighters going from all different portions of the state in order to attack a wildfire. That's where it kind of moves into that moment where it's now an emergency for the local jurisdiction or the government entity, because at that point, we're not only stressing our local resources by sending them all together, but at the same time, we have this moment where we are also still having to attend to the normal things that are going on. And we always, in every emergency training that we do, we talk about having these earthquakes. That stresses every single resource. That stresses public works, community services, the police and fire departments as well. But at the same time, I always remind people that there's still going to be a mother who's going to give birth at that moment. So how do we also respond to this emergency, but at the same time maintain our services that we have to maintain for these general life safety emergencies, where for this mother, the baby is not going to wait. So we have to have that balance. And that's where we kind of start looking at maintaining these normal services while also maintaining these large scale catastrophic services. And when we get to that point, that's where we start realizing, if I can't maintain our essential services throughout, we've reached that peak where we're at an emergency.
Yeah, and I imagine too that there is so much to coordinate on, like you were mentioning, on the macro level of trying to, if you're talking about the fire and the fire is getting out of control, and having to manage that and coordinate the care with the fire department and first responders. But at the same time, like you said, there's going to be that individual that's struggling with a personal thing and needing to manage that and to get that person the appropriate resource. So when there is a situation like that, how do you prioritize?
Yeah, there's been times where you start seeing that happen, where you unfortunately you have to triage. And during the COVID incident, you're starting to hear more doctors talking about triaging patients. Unfortunately, we really never talked about that in the United States, because we've always had this very robust medical system. It's the best in the world. But at the same time, when it is put to the test and it's stressed beyond its normal capacity, you start hearing these terms where people are saying, "I'm rationing care," and I'm rationing services. And that's kind of where we look at it and go, there's a moment where we start having to look at this and go, what is the what is the next step when we deal with these things? From an emergency, we go, okay, our hospitals can't take any more people. Our ambulance providers can't drive any more people to the hospital because we just don't have any more ambulances. So the planning that emergency management professionals like to do is kind of look at that and explore what are those avenues that we can utilize in order to handle those things. And we say there are certain people that we have to triage, and we say these are the individuals that we must take care of at all times. And then we also have the second group or third group of individuals who we have to figure out how to make it work in their place. We might not be able to provide services to everyone at every moment, but can we do the greatest amount of good in that moment? And it's a very utilitarian argument of being able to look at the picture that way. But we also have to remind people, just because you have an emergency doesn't mean you have to go to the hospital. And just having that moment where you have those discussions with people saying, our next, on a normal basis, we would take you to the hospital. But on this day, because we're rationing care, we're going to provide those services to you at your home. And we're going to have you just kind of wait here for a little bit. That's how we begin to kind of really look at the emergency situation and planning. And we triage care, and that's what we end up doing in those moments.
In the moments where, like you said, there's people that may feel like they would like to call 911 and go to the hospital or get an ambulance, and those people have to be triaged because there's just not enough adequate resources during that time being. Who is the one that actually tells them that?
So it actually is it's one of those things where, depending on what type of incident it is, it can be a moment where the hospitals are actually dictating that. The hospitals are saying, we're at capacity, we can't take any more people. As fire and police and emergency services for local jurisdictions, we don't run the hospitals. So we just can't say, well, you're going to take these people. If we can't provide beds, if they don't have nurses and doctors to take care of those individuals, it's not in our benefit to actually send those individuals to that place. We're actually doing more harm at that moment. So we can figure out a way to have those conversations with our doctors and hospital agencies. We have very good communication with them, and it's whether it's an active shooter, if those types of things where they're going to see an immediate surge of patients in a short amount of time, we have systems where we can tell them, you have 15 patients that are coming to you in the next 5 minutes. Those hospitals can say, we have the ability to accept that, or we don't. And those systems are in place and they're utilized every single day. But most of the time, those questions and answers are going to be coming from our emergency medical providers, and we will adjust our field response based off of that.
As a kind of follow-up question to that, I understand that you work in a more macro capacity in overseeing city emergencies and coordination of care and training. Do you do anything more on a one-on-one individual basis with whether that be external stakeholders or internal stakeholders, where you're having conversations with them and doing more face-to-face conversational type of care?
So I rarely go out into the field in my capacity. As far as the way that we like to operate is, we end up really spending time with our employees, because myself, I can't respond to the entire city. I'm one person, and I work in an office of 3. So with the 3 of us, pretty much we are tasked with ensuring that we can kind of have that moment where we can get as many people trained up as much as possible to be able to respond. Because where we are as emergency management professionals is it's a moment where we have to make sure that the system is operating as intended. So we kind of are those people that are kind of watching in the room, making sure that everything's working as designed. So with that, we rarely do go out into the field. But the other side of it is, when we do go out into the field, it is not just to, show our presence and, be that political figure. We are not those types of people. We're there to remind people, keep everything going in the way that the system should be designed. So it kind of turns into the place where you go to the shelter and you look and say, okay, is everything being set up the way it's supposed to? Are we taking care of the people that are in wheelchairs or the people that are in walkers? Um, because there's a large access and functional needs component of this where it is our role to make sure that we're taking care of everyone on an individual basis. But at the same time, we have to do that from a macro level.
Mhm.
And it's really hard to do that because you don't know about everyone's situation. So with that, we do our best to train up everyone, bake all the good things into the plan as much as possible. So when the plan gets exercised, we know we're taking care of, we have a playpen at our shelters because we know that there's going to be someone that's going to be showing up with a kid that wants to just play. We know that there's going to be someone that's going to be showing up in a wheelchair. So can they physically get into the door and have a restroom to use? All of those things we kind of train up. So in the event that we are the ones that have to provide indirect care, we know that our staff are really trained up to be able to do that. So to loop back to the question, are we the ones that are providing direct care? No, but we are doing our best to ensure that our staff and the people that we work with on a daily basis have the right tools to be able to do that.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, you certainly have, considering what you had spoken about earlier, a long list of job duties. And so I imagine that a lot centers around policy and macro. And so it's interesting to hear how you do work on an individual micro level, but on a different type of basis than somebody that is a first responder or mental health professional would. The other question that I had is so obviously the world is going through a lot right now. We're in a pandemic, COVID cases are increasing. And on top of all of that, there has been other things that have taken place in our society, including protests, also the wildfires that have happened in the past year. So, considering everything that we're kind of going through, what has been your response to all of these disasters happening or emergency situations, I guess I should say, and what are the plans that have been put in place?
Yeah, the 2020 and going into 2021 has definitely been a challenge for the emergency management profession as a whole. And with that, we end up as a very close group of people, specifically in California. We realize that our partners and our colleagues are dealing with all of these things at one time. So it is our benefit to actually make sure that we're sending out resources as much as possible. So we share a lot of information. For myself, I've developed a lot of plans specifically for COVID-19 with making sure that when we do stand up different types of venues, whether it be a testing site or a vaccination site, we have a plan that works for us. The other thing that works with that is knowing that we are very stressed with time and we are very burdened with a lot of different emergencies. Instead of just holding that to myself, I make sure I share that plan with my colleagues in different jurisdictions and different counties. And I say, I don't know if you would like to utilize this plan, but here's a plan that has been designed, it's worked, it's vetted. So we share those types of things. When it comes to all the different types of emergencies as well as we actually go out and fill in for each other as much as possible. So I just don't work for the city that I work for. I will go and help on emergencies. For instance, when we had large wildfires in the LA County area for the Bobcat fire, um, we had that was going for months and months and months while COVID was going on, and just after, I believe it was just after or just before George Floyd emergencies started happening. So when we start having that happen, we understand that we're going to have burnout. So in my professional capacity, I will ask my supervision, hey, do you mind if I go to the county or do you mind if I go to this different city to give my colleagues a break over there? And we share plans all the time. So in the event that I pick up and go and help in another city, I can just drop into that seat and go, I know exactly what I'm doing because everything is laid out in this plan. So before all of these things happen, the plans are never 100%. That's why we call them a plan. We plan to have it happen, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, we adjust. And we make these plans in place because we know that there's going to be moments where we're not going to be able to do it all by ourselves. So the plans that we have, emergency operations plans, are sometimes very generic, but they give us our foundation as emergency managers to be able to operate in different cities and different capacities. And no matter what the emergency is, we know that we can adapt to whatever it's doing because we have these systems in place that will work. As far as going from all of these different types of emergencies in a short amount of time, there was definitely a point where we looked at our plans and we realized our plans did not really cover all of these different things. So we had those moments where we hopped on the phone with all the emergency managers from a different region and say, hey, what can we do better? What are we missing? Um, is the plan as designed working for your entity? And that's kind of where we start collaborating more and more to refine our plans and help each other as much as possible, refine those plans. But at the same time, you have those moments where you just need to give someone a break, and people will step in and they'll help you as much as possible.
Yeah, considering all of the different emergencies that have popped up over the course of 2020, what would you say was the most challenging one? And you can answer this in just the context of how it affected the world, not necessarily just Santa Monica City. So what would you say to that?
I would say that it was definitely the George Floyd protest. Those were things that were very fluid. People had very strong feelings about it. I myself had very strong feelings of it. So when seeing that happen, um, I knew that society in the United States was definitely on a tipping point. We had already been through 4 to 6 months of a lockdown in many portions of the United States, especially here in Los Angeles County. We had been in those moments where people were already under very, um, very strong lockdowns in the area, which kept people at home, and people were already going, cabinet, pretty much developing cabin fever. There's a lot of people that lost their jobs. There are a lot of people that were not only having to work from home, but also having to deal with their kids at home. So there are a lot of things that we were tasked with dealing with on a daily basis and coping with. But then you have this moment where society saw this horrendous murder on TV. And when you see that, it was a trigger for a lot of people. And these combinations actually they showed up, and you saw very large protests. You saw anger, and from the emergency management perspective and my professional capacity, how did I have a role in this, and what should I do? Then there's a moment where you ask yourself, am I contributing to the pain of individuals with me just exercising the plan that we've pretty much put in place? And you kind of take a step back, and you don't want to make things worse. And you understand that you work for government, and people are really mad at specific sectors of the government. So that was probably the most challenging incident for this year, because before you made any decision, you had to make sure that you were in line um, with what the community wanted out of you, or were you contributing to their animosity towards the government? So on a professional level, there was significant challenges. On a personal level, seeing it as a Black man, knowing that our history is very complex, and sometimes people are not always attuned with our history. Knowing that there was that whole personal side where a lot of people forget that people in government are people as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be able to work and support our community as much as possible. So that's definitely the one that hit me the most.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I imagine, like you were mentioning, the balance of trying to find, I guess you could say, a happy medium, or fulfill the role of kind of all the hats that you wear, right? As this emergency coordinator, and being this person that works for the city and the government, and wanting to uphold the standards to that, but also, again, seeing just this history of racism and all of the racial trauma that people of color have really faced throughout history. But now we have evidence, like through video, because of social media and all of the technology that we have, and actually to have it on camera. and for people to see that. And like you said, I think a huge factor of just people being at home and not being able to go out due to social distancing measures. So that mixed with seeing the murder of George Floyd, for example, although there's been several others, that causing all of this civil unrest. I imagine that must have been hard for you in your position, but also as a society and as a culture at large, that was a very challenging time. So considering, having said that, that was one of the most challenging things for you to see, how did you manage that just in your personal life?
Yeah, there was actually a moment. We had regular protests here in the Los Angeles region, and for me, it was a moment where I needed to get out, and I had to join the protests. So that was one of those moments where I kind of took it upon myself in my personal capacity to say I understand the pain, and I have the pain as well. So yes, I'm going to go out and join the protest. So I'm going to do my best to put my mask on. So I made sure I had my double, triple mask on as much as possible, because I don't want to get it. Don't want to be a person who contracts COVID-19 or a person that spreads it. But I needed to get my voice out because there was that moment where my work is one thing, but me as a human is another thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I, made sure that I went to the protest. The protest that got out of hand, I made sure that I left because, I understand that I also work in a public safety entity, and I don't want to be wrapped up in that.
Mm-hmm.
There is that balance where I understood both sides of it, but I understand that I also need to, be cognizant of what I do as a professional. Can't be out there burning cars and then go back to work the next day and, try to be an emergency manager. So there's that moment where that happened. I'm a big book reader. I love to read. And I emphasize book because there's just something about reading a book for me that's still calming, and just that moment of just reading on paper kind of allows for me to notate with, pen and paper. And so those things are the moments where you just kind of like, I'm going to kind of take a step back, do certain things at certain moments. But then there's moments where I also kind of like to learn a little bit more, like, what am I doing wrong? Is the other side right? I used to do debate in undergrad. And when I did debate, there was a moment where I was paired up with someone who we were politically the most far away from each other as possible. But one thing is we were debate partners, so we had to listen to each other. So with those moments, I've always ingrained in myself when tested as much as possible, to go out and try to figure out what the other side is saying or what their beliefs are. And that's kind of how I got through the George Floyd situation, was by kind of going out and just immersing myself in that moment to kind of rejuvenate what I was doing on a daily basis. Am I doing this right? How can I do it better? What's the other side saying? And kind of immerse myself in just literature.
Yeah, I was going to say that's very open-minded of you. I think the country and everybody knows that this has been the most divided that we've seen the nation. And so when people talk about going over to hear the other side or to really immerse ourselves in, what the other argument may be, I mean, that's very rare. But I also imagine that doing that creates some healing, because you're coming at it from a point of view and a perspective of wanting to learn and wanting to hear what the other side has to say, as opposed to just trying to get your point across and being one-sided. And that's something that our culture could really benefit from, right? Is having that open mind and going into things with the mentality of wanting to learn, as opposed to just having a complete guard up and going in with blinders. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. The other thing too is, I know that you said that you like to read books and that helps you, but I would think that in your position, I think you mentioned too before that it is a high burnout rate in your profession. And I can imagine that, because if you're constantly putting out fires, I mean, in a metaphorical but also a literal type of perspective, that there's just a lot of stress in that type of environment. And When we had talked before, you had also mentioned that you try to rotate personnel because sometimes they can get burnt out with all of the things that have been happening in the world too. So, from a personal standpoint, sounds like you're reading books and that's helping alleviate some of the stress. But is there anything else that you've been doing to manage stress, or anything that you can suggest to people to manage the stress based on the fact that the world is just going through a very challenging time right now, and in 2020 in particular, and then kind of that transitioning over to this new year of 2021?
Yeah, there's been a lot of things professionally and personally that I've done to kind of make sure that we are reminding ourselves that we are human. Um, Professionally, what we've done is bringing in upwards of 30 to 40 people into an emergency operations center who do not work in that setting on a daily basis. That in itself is going to be a stressful one. So my role as the emergency manager for the city is to kind of go in and definitely do my best to ensure that when they do show up, they're comfortable, it's a welcoming place, and it does as much to not create additional stress on them. So, you have the basic things, and, we laugh about it, but it's like the first thing that an emergency manager wants to bring in is a coffee maker, because you want someone to just kind of be able to sit there and go, at least I have some coffee. But we start off the day with especially if it's going to be a long incident, we do our best to start off the day by like showing a funny video, something to just remind people that it is okay to laugh. It's okay to, remind ourselves that there are things that are going on that bring a sense of normalcy. And, you kind of walk around, you start talking with people. We were in a very, it's not a close setting, but, we were in a condensed room where we would sit there and we would talk and, just ask people, how's your family doing? And when you start recognizing that you can ask somebody about how their family's doing in the middle of a global pandemic, you see that smile come out of someone, and just kind of like, oh yeah, like my family's good. It's not all about COVID-19, because of course we're going to do our best to respond as much as possible. But if someone can just think about their kids for a moment, that brings joy. Um, we have a couple of police dogs that are, really good to just kind of play around with. And we also have a few dogs that our police department, they run a animal shelter, and they'll bring up dogs that are up for adoption, and we'll let the dogs run around the office, and people are just happy about that. And we have those moments where it's like, yeah, it's all right, just go outside, and we try to coerce other people to take home and adopt a pet and things like that. And those are those moments where it's great to have just that separation for even for 5 minutes, because outside of that, it's stress in a fast moving environment. And then we also know, let's not try to tax these people as much as possible. So we do our best to, hey, if you've been here for like 4 or 5 days straight, okay, let's switch you out. Let's have the next team come in and give you a break, so they can go back and be with their families and kind of release some of that stress that they have. Personally, for me, everyone has had to kind of come up with a COVID hobby with all the lockdowns and things like that. So, for me, I bought a bicycle right before. It was very fortunate that I bought a bicycle right before the lockdowns went into place. So I ride my bike a lot. That's kind of my exercise / getting out and just kind of riding as much as possible. And then I also bought a camera, and being able to just go out and just like learn photography, something that I've always liked, and but I've always done it from a cell phone. So it's nice to be able to just do it from a real camera now and see what that looks like. So it separates me. It gets me out of dealing with emergencies on a very, on an ongoing and consistent basis. But now I can do these two things that I haven't done in my life and learn something new, but at the same time, maintain my sanity.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. I mean, I think a lot of people have started up new, like you said, COVID hobbies, which is helpful because if you're in compliance with social distancing, hopefully, you've been at home and you want to do something, so that can kind of help fill up time. But you also bring up a point of the humanity in it. I think that when we're, and you can probably speak more to this, but I would assume that when we're in a worldwide crisis or pandemic, everybody is kind of just focused on that. So when you're having conversations with people like that, macro, if we're talking about macro and policy, how that affects like the micro and individual interactions, if that's affecting everybody in the world, then that's going to shift the dynamic of interactions and the types of conversations people have. And so instead of asking, like you said, how's your family? How's your mom and dad doing? Sometimes that conversation may shift more to, oh my gosh, did you hear how many more people died from COVID in Italy or something? And so you bring up such an important point. So I'm really glad that you mentioned it, about bringing the humanity back into the conversation of those daily interactions and the dynamic that you have with somebody. And even if you're not meeting with somebody in person, having that virtual connection with them, kind of like what we're doing right now, and just asking more personable questions, and even questions such as, how are you doing right now, considering what's going on? Like, I just want to know how you are doing. And that's such an important thing that I think gets overlooked so much. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And yeah, that's something that we all could definitely learn from.
There are all these things that end up happening. I know a lot of people that have been working in the hospitals since the start of COVID, and everyone's talking about the patients, and we see the photos and things like that of the doctors and nurses that are out there. And a lot of the times you see the photos are about the pain that they have. And a lot of the times, like, you sit there and you remind yourself, like, I hope someone is actually asking them how they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you started seeing, at some point, you started seeing the nurses and doctors starting to break, because there was just so much stress and so much pain. We've seen nurses and doctors just getting angry at members of the community for wanting to shop. And, it went from, we're here to help you, to how dare you want to shop, when I'm out here trying to save all these people's lives. So that's where you start looking at that and start reminding people there is humanity in all of the stuff we're doing, whether it be a nurse or a teacher or, just regular life, or us in emergency management. There's humanity in all of it. So you got to make sure that you're taking care of it.
Yeah, certainly. And it's interesting too that you bring that up, because from what we've talked about in our call today, you mentioned that you manage emergencies at a more policy macro level for the city. And so to hear that somebody in your position is still really focused on the humanity aspect and the interaction, the micro level types of conversations, is just very enlightening and good to hear.
One of the things that is the foundation of how, like, whether it be my education, what I've come up with, is I remind people that emergencies are about people. They're about people first. And when I actually teach a class to the members of the community, we pretty much just talk about, and I show them two different pictures. One is a river, and then one's an area where a river's just flowing, there's nothing around. I asked them, is there a problem if this river floods right now? And they look at the picture, there's nothing around. They're like, no, there's no problem, because there's nothing around. I show them the river about 5 miles down. That same river floods, and it floods a community. And I say, is there a problem now? And they say yes, because people have lost their homes, people have lost things. But at the same time, I remind them, it's about people. And emergencies, at the moment where you start looking at these things, when people don't exist in those moments, yeah, we really don't have as much of attachment to them. And we remind ourselves, it's about the humanity. It could be about animals and people, but at the root of it, emergencies are about humanity, and we have to always make sure that we're tending to that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's a good analogy. And lastly, I wanted to ask you too, in case anybody is wondering how to get a position like yours in the city or for the government in emergency services that manages things at the capacity that you do. Can you tell us a little bit about your education and how you got to the position that you're in now?
Yeah, so I started off as working for a fire department as a fire inspector, doing a lot of, going through and checking, making sure that people's businesses were safe. Things like, making sure that if there was too many people inside, you could get out. And I looked at that. I got my very foundational job, and I started that right out of high school as I was going through undergrad. But I was always a person that wanted to do public administration, making sure that what could we do for the public good. So after that, kind of worked for the fire department for about 5 years in that fire prevention capacity, where the main things that I walked around talking to and trying to work on a daily basis was mitigation and prevention. Response is great, but it's even better when you don't have to respond because things are built or designed in the way that's, our human culture adapts to these things that are more safe. So after that, I went to Georgetown University. I got my master's degree there in emergency and disaster management. Looking at that from a very large perspective, macro level, not just locally on the domestic level, but how's climate change shifting emergency managers? How is major wildfires down in Australia? How does that affect different people in the United States? So kind of looking at all of these different things, I kind of started seeing how you just can't really focus on one thing. Emergency managers, especially in California, they're all my colleagues. I love them all, but we always talk about earthquakes, and they're great. They're great to talk about. We can do our best, but there's more to it, and that's kind of where I brought some of my debate experience from undergrad and this world view of emergency management to the city. And there's different ways of getting into emergency services. There's the private sector where emergency managers for public or private entities are here for business continuity, whether it be a bank that's just been hit with a hurricane. People are still going to need money. People are still going to need to go to an ATM. So that bank needs to be able to say, how do I maintain those continuity of services? For me, as an emergency management professional, I love just making sure people can have that resilience. I like resistance more, but resilience will have to do sometimes. So I do my best to ensure that I can go out and talk to people. So I took my education, bringing it from fire prevention, talking about emergency mitigation and prevention, then taking on this macro level global view of emergency management. And now I'm in a somewhat large city. When it comes down to emergency management here, we have a lot of complex things that I have to respond to, whether it be a pre-planned event and just knowing all of the things that go into that, not from a emergency response, but from a security and law enforcement perspective. But in the event that everything goes sideways, how do you appropriately make sure that you have everything ready? And my experience working for a police department, a fire department, and now the city in the city manager's office, all of that experience in combination with my education has allowed me to be able to go out and utilize all those things and make sense of things. So in the event where the Boston Marathon, no one planned for that, but at the same time, someone knew who were the right people to bring to the table. So if it did happen, we could respond. And it's very hard to get into this field because you're supposed to know a lot. But at the same time, if you don't have all of the information, at least you know who you need to contact.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time here today and talking about your job, and also sharing so many other things that are related to that and how you've been impacted by the current state of our world right now. And thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your service, because the work that you do is so important. And, the macro side of things, we talk about policy and macro a lot in social work, because I'm actually a social worker. I'm getting my PhD in psychology, but in the social work field, there are really two types of arenas that you can go towards, either more micro work, so the more individual, or the more macro. And a lot of social workers get into social work to do like the more clinical type of work. But there's also a population of people that really want to get into policy and macro level. And so having somebody like you speak on that piece, I think is so important because we see how much your work impacts the community at large, again, from the policy level, but how that trickles down and affects the individual interactions that we have. And so anybody that is interested in a position like yours, I think, learned a lot from you today and what you had to say about it. And again, thank you so much for all of that work that you do for our city, but just again, also for our community at large. So is there anything else that you wanted to add before we close up?
Yeah, I just thank you for having me. I appreciate it. A lot of the work that emergency managers do across the nation, across the world, are they're here to help, and we are definitely a group of people that we do things behind the scenes, but we want to make sure that our members of our community, the members that we work with on a daily basis, are safe, and everyone can go home to their family. So that's one of the things that we pride ourselves on, and we appreciate the opportunity to just serve the members of our community. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for watching. I really want to thank Mr. Stephen Torrence for taking the time to talk to me and share this information with all of us about emergency services and how he helps our community. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button for more videos like this. I really appreciate it. Hitting that like and subscribe button and sharing this information is very helpful to me and to our mental health community. Until then, managing mental health matters.